"Step aside, ma'am. We need to run your bag through the machine again." The words cut through the chaos of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3 like a blade through silk, and Dr. Keisha Washington knew immediately that her New Year's Eve was about to become a nightmare she'd never forget. The digital clock above the TSA checkpoint glowed an angry red 10:47 p.m., and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, snow whipped across the tarmac in sheets so thick they looked like moving walls. It was the kind of storm that grounded planes and stranded dreams, the kind that turned airports into refugee camps, filled with desperate travelers clutching boarding passes like lottery tickets to anywhere but here. Keisha stood frozen in the pre-check line, her matte black Toomey carry-on still sitting on the conveyor belt where she'd placed it moments before, watching the X-ray technician squint at his monitor with the kind of theatrical concentration that meant trouble was brewing. At 41, she'd learned to read the signs of impending discrimination the way meteorologists read storm patterns, and right now every instinct she'd developed during 2 decades of navigating corporate boardrooms and government contracts was screaming that she was about to be caught in the eye of a very personal hurricane. She wore a charcoal wool Max Mara coat over a cream cashmere sweater and dark designer jeans. Her natural hair pulled back into a sleek low bun that projected the kind of effortless sophistication that came from surviving both the South Side of Chicago and the snake pit of Silicon Valley venture capital meetings. Her luggage contained nothing more threatening than silk blouses, encrypted laptops, and the kind of expensive moisturizers that made first-class travel bearable. But she could already feel the weight of suspicious stares from the TSA officers clustering around the checkpoint like vultures circling fresh roadkill. The officer who'd spoken was tall and broad-shouldered with platinum blonde hair cropped military short and the kind of pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through people rather than at them. His name tag read B. Morrison, and he carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd discovered that a uniform and a badge could transform personal insecurities into institutional power. He was maybe 34 or 35, with the soft belly of middle age creeping over his regulation belt and the permanent scowl of a man who'd watched other people get promoted while he remained stuck checking bags and confiscating water bottles. "Is there a problem with my luggage?" Keisha asked, her voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that usually made boardroom executives straighten their spines and pay attention. She'd spent the last 3 days in meetings with Pentagon officials closing a $500 million contract that would make her cybersecurity firm the primary contractor for the Department of Defense's most sensitive digital infrastructure, and she was bone-tired from the kind of high-stakes negotiations that could make or break careers with a single misplaced word. Morrison's eyes flickered over her face, taking in her features with the kind of slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin crawl. "Just routine screening, ma'am," he said, drawing out the word ma'am like it was something distasteful he needed to spit out. "Sometimes the machine picks up anomalies that need a closer look." But Keisha could see the lie in his eyes, could read the calculation behind his plastic smile. This wasn't routine, and they both knew it. This was what happened when someone who'd spent their career feeling overlooked and undervalued suddenly found themselves face to face with a black woman whose coat cost more than his monthly salary, whose confidence radiated the kind of success he'd convinced himself he deserved, but had never achieved. This was the moment when resentment crystallized into action, when personal failures found a convenient target, dressed in designer clothes and carrying herself like she belonged in first-class lounges and corner offices. Around them, the terminal buzzed with the desperate energy of New Year's Eve travelers trying to reach their destinations before midnight struck, and another year slipped away. Families clustered around charging stations, business people paced while shouting into phones, couples argued over missed connections and ruined plans. Everyone was stressed, everyone was tired, and everyone just wanted to be somewhere else, which made them the perfect audience for whatever performance Morrison was about to stage. Keisha checked her Cartier watch and felt her stomach tighten. Her flight to Reagan National boarded in 43 minutes, and she'd promised her 8-year-old daughter Zara that they'd watch the ball drop together from their Georgetown townhouse, just the three of them curled up on the couch with hot chocolate, and the kind of lazy family time that had become increasingly rare as her company grew. Her husband Marcus would have dinner waiting candles-lit champagne chilled the perfect end to a year that had brought more success than she'd ever dared to imagine. But first, she had to get through whatever Blake Morrison had planned for her, and judging by the way he was pulling on latex gloves with the slow ceremony of a surgeon preparing for a complicated operation, she suspected it was going to be a very long night indeed. Blake Morrison had been having what his therapist would have called a triggering day, if he'd been the type of man who believed in therapy, which he decidedly was not. He'd started his shift at 6 a.m. to discover that his promotion to supervisory position had been given to Janet Rodriguez, a woman 15 years younger who'd been on the job half as long but apparently possessed what HR called natural leadership qualities, and what Blake privately referred to as diversity hire advantages. He'd spent the morning watching her give orders to agents who used to be his peers, watching them smile and nod with the kind of respect they'd never shown him, and by evening his jaw ached from grinding his teeth. The thing about power was that once you'd tasted it, even the small-time authority that came with a TSA uniform and the right to make people remove their shoes, you became addicted to the feeling of control it provided. Blake had never been the smartest guy in any room, had never been the most charming or the most successful. But for 8 years, he'd had the ability to make travelers jump through hoops with a single pointed finger to delay flights in empty bags and watch important people become supplicants begging for his approval. It wasn't much, but it was his. And watching Janet Rodriguez settle into the supervisor's office that should have been his had left him feeling like a stripped wire dangerous and looking for somewhere to discharge. When Keisha Washington walked up to his checkpoint, everything about her seemed designed to remind him of his failures. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never been told she didn't belong anywhere, who'd never had to prove her right to occupy space or speak in meetings or expect service with a smile. Her coat probably cost more than his car payment. Her luggage was the kind of sleek professional gear he saw in airport advertisements featuring successful executives jetting off to important meetings, and she had the kind of natural authority that made people automatically assume she was in charge of whatever room she entered. But here in this little kingdom of metal detectors and X-ray machines, Blake Morrison was still the king, and queens, like Keisha Washington, were just subjects who needed to remember their place. "Boarding pass and ID," he said, extending his hand without looking up from his computer screen, a small power play he'd perfected over years of making important people wait for his attention. Keisha handed over her documents smoothly, her movements economical and professional. Her passport showed stamps from London, Tokyo, Singapore, evidence of the kind of international lifestyle that Blake could only imagine from watching movies. Her boarding pass indicated first-class seating on United Flight 447, the kind of premium travel experience that cost more than he made in a week. Blake studied her passport photo, comparing it to her face with exaggerated care. "Dr. Keisha Washington," he read aloud, pronouncing each syllable with deliberate precision. "That's quite a fancy title. What kind of doctor are you exactly?" "Computer science." Keisha replied, her voice neutral, but her eyes showing the first flicker of wariness. She'd played this game before recognized the particular tone that meant trouble was brewing. "Computer science," Blake repeated as if the concept was foreign to him. "And what brings you to Chicago on New Year's Eve business or pleasure?" It was a question designed to probe to establish that he had the right to demand explanations for her presence, her travel plans, her very existence in his checkpoint. Keisha felt the familiar weight of being required to justify herself to someone who had no real authority over her life but wielded just enough institutional power to make her day miserable. Business, she said, simply not offering elaboration because she'd learned that additional information only provided more ammunition for people looking to find problems. Blake's eyes lingered on her face, then traveled down to her expensive coat, her designer bag, the subtle gold jewelry that spoke of success and security. Everything about her seemed to mock his own circumstances, his small apartment, his stalled career, his growing certainty that the world was conspiring to keep him from getting what he deserved. Traveling alone, he asked, though her documents clearly showed a single passenger. It was another probe, another small violation designed to establish his dominance in this interaction. Yes, Keisha said, checking her watch discreetly. 38 minutes until boarding. Blake handed back her documents with exaggerated slowness, letting his fingers brush against hers in a contact that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. Lane 4, he said, pointing toward the pre-check line with a smile that never reached his eyes. Have a safe flight, Dr. Washington. But even as she walked toward the metal detectors, Blake was already deciding that her flight wasn't going to be safe at all. In fact, he was going to make sure it was the most memorable travel experience of her very privileged life, and by the time he was finished with her, she'd understand exactly who was really in charge at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The first violation of Keisha's dignity came disguised as routine procedure, which was exactly how Blake Morrison preferred to operate. He waited until she'd walked through the metal detector without incident. Waited until she reached for her bag on the other side of the X-ray machine before stepping out from behind his station and clearing his throat with theatrical authority. "Ma'am, I need to inspect your luggage," he announced loudly enough for the entire checkpoint to hear his voice carrying the kind of official weight that automatically made other travelers look up from their phones and boarding passes. The scanner detected some irregularities that require manual examination. Keisha paused her hand inches from her bag's handle and felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a setup. She'd been through airport security hundreds of times, had sailed through pre-check lines from Los Angeles to London without incident, and she knew with absolute certainty that her carefully packed luggage contained nothing that would trigger any legitimate screening concerns. But she also knew that facts were irrelevant when someone with a badge and a grudge decided to make their power felt. "What kind of irregularities?" she asked, keeping her voice level and professional, even as she felt dozens of eyes turning toward her fellow travelers, suddenly transformed into an audience for whatever performance Blake was about to stage. Blake pulled on latex gloves with deliberate slowness, snapping each finger into place like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Dense objects in unusual configurations. He said the technical language designed to sound official while meaning absolutely nothing. Computer equipment that doesn't match standard profiles. Could be anything from prohibited electronics to... He paused dramatically, letting the implications hang in the air. "Well, let's just say we need to be thorough." The metal examination table was cold and scarred from years of use, its surface marked with scratches and stains from thousands of previous searches. Blake lifted Keisha's Toomey bag with unnecessary force, dropping it onto the table hard enough to make the metal ring like a bell. The sound echoed through the checkpoint area, and Keisha winced as she imagined her laptop and tablet rattling around inside despite their protective cases. "Step back, please," Blake commanded, gesturing for her to move away from the table as if she might interfere with his investigation. "Hands where I can see them." It was a small humiliation, but effective. Suddenly, Keisha wasn't a successful CEO traveling home to her family. She was a suspect being processed, her movements restricted and monitored. Around them, other passengers began to whisper and point, phones appearing in hands like digital vultures drawn to the scent of drama. Blake unzipped her bag with exaggerated care, as if he expected something dangerous to leap out. Inside, her belongings were packed with the meticulous organization of someone who lived on airplanes and had learned to maximize every square inch of luggage space. Silk blouses folded in tissue paper, a leather toiletry case, her backup chargers and cables arranged in a separate pouch, everything in its designated place. But Blake treated her possessions like evidence in a crime scene, lifting eake item and examining it with theatrical suspicion before dropping it carelessly onto the metal table. Her favorite Hermes scarf, a gift from Marcus on their anniversary, landed in a wrinkled heap next to her laptop case. Her toiletry bag was opened, and each item removed expensive serums and creams lined up like contraband for everyone to see. "This is quite a collection of electronics," Blake observed, pulling out her laptop tablet and phone chargers. The laptop was a custom-built machine designed for her work with classified government contracts, its matte black case unmarked, but obviously expensive. "What exactly do you need all this computing power for?" "My work," Keisha replied, watching helplessly as Blake turned her laptop over in his hands, his fingers leaving smudges on the carefully maintained surface. "I run a technology company." "Technology company?" Blake repeated as if the concept amused him. "What kind of technology exactly? Because this equipment looks pretty specialized, almost military grade, you might say." It was a fishing expedition disguised as security screening, and Keisha felt her patience beginning to fray. The laptop contained encrypted files related to her Defense Department contracts, information so sensitive that it required special clearances just to access. Blake had no right to examine it, no authority to question its contents, but he held it like a trophy while dozens of strangers watched and recorded. "I'm a cybersecurity consultant," she said, each word carefully controlled. "The equipment is standard for my industry." Blake's smile grew wider, feeding off her discomfort like a parasite drawing sustenance from its host. "Cybersecurity," he mused, setting the laptop down with deliberate carelessness. "That sounds like the kind of work that might require someone to carry sensitive materials, maybe even classified information." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn, and Keisha realized with crystal clarity that this was only the beginning of what Blake Morrison had planned for her. 27 minutes until boarding, and Keisha Washington was beginning to understand that she was trapped in a nightmare designed specifically for her humiliation. Blake Morrison had finished his theatrical examination of her belongings, spreading her personal items across the metal table like artifacts in a museum of manufactured suspicion. But instead of repacking her bag and sending her on her way, he was pulling out his radio with the satisfied smile of a predator who'd cornered his prey exactly where he wanted them. "Control. This is Morrison at Checkpoint Alpha," he said into the device, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone playing to an audience. "I'm going to need a female officer for a secondary screening. Passenger is showing multiple risk indicators. Risk indicators." The words hit Keisha like a slap across the face, transforming her from a successful businesswoman into a potential threat in the space of a single radio transmission. Around the checkpoint, other travelers had stopped pretending to mind their own business and were openly staring now, phones held high to capture whatever was about to unfold. She could already imagine the social media posts, the headlines, the way her professional reputation would be dissected by strangers who'd judge her based on a 30-second video clip stripped of all context. The female officer who responded to Blake's summons looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Officer Sarah Martinez was young, maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and the kind of uncomfortable expression that suggested she recognized exactly what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it. She approached the examination table with obvious reluctance, her eyes darting between Blake's expectant face and Keisha's controlled fury. "What's the situation?" Morrison Martinez asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and didn't like it. Random selection flagged her for additional screening. Blake lied smoothly, the words rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Plus, I found some irregularities during the bag search that warrant a more thorough examination." He gestured toward Keisha's laptop and electronics still scattered across the metal table like evidence at a crime scene. High-end electronics, suspicious travel patterns, evasive responses to routine questions. Each accusation was carefully crafted to sound official while being impossible to disprove in the moment, and Keisha felt the familiar rage that came with being gaslit by someone who held just enough institutional power to make their lies stick. But she also recognized the trap that was being laid for her. Any attempt to defend herself would be twisted into evidence of suspicious behavior. Any show of anger would be labeled as aggression. Any demand for fair treatment would become resistance to legitimate authority. "I need you to step over here, ma'am," Martinez said quietly, gesturing toward a small alcove beside the main checkpoint area. Her voice carried an apologetic undertone that suggested she understood the injustice of what she was being asked to do but lacked the authority or courage to refuse. "I'm going to have to conduct a pat-down search." This was the moment when Keisha's composure finally began to crack. She'd endured the bag search with dignity, had maintained her professional demeanor while Blake pawed through her personal belongings and made his snide comments. But the prospect of being touched and groped by strangers while dozens of people recorded her humiliation pushed her to the edge of what any human being should be expected to tolerate. "Officer Martinez," she said, her voice still controlled but carrying an edge of steel that made the younger woman flinch slightly. "I've already walked through the metal detector without incident. I'm pre-check qualified. My bag has been thoroughly searched." What possible justification could there be for a physical pat-down? Blake stepped forward before Martinez could respond, inserting himself into the conversation with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd found his rhythm and wasn't about to let anyone disrupt his performance. "The justification is that I'm a federal officer conducting a legitimate security screening and you're a passenger who needs to comply with established protocols or find another way to travel tonight." His words carried the implicit threat that most travelers feared above all others, the possibility of missing their flight, of being stranded in an airport, while their carefully laid plans crumbled around them. It was the nuclear option of airport authority, and Blake wielded it like a weapon designed specifically to force compliance through fear and desperation. But as Keisha looked around the checkpoint area, she noticed something that gave her a small measure of hope. An elderly Asian woman sitting in a nearby chair waiting for her own flight was watching the proceedings with the kind of sharp attention that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and disapproved completely. The woman was maybe 70 years old, well-dressed in the understated way that suggested old money and good breeding, and she was holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The child was staring at Keisha with wide, confused eyes, her young mind clearly struggling to understand why the nice lady in the pretty coat was being treated like she'd done something wrong. Grandma Lily, the little girl, whispered loudly enough for Keisha to hear, "Why are they being mean to her?" The elderly woman, who Keisha would later learn was Mrs. Lillian Chen, squeezed her granddaughter's hand and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of someone who'd lived through enough history to recognize injustice when she saw it. "Because sometimes, Emma, people with small hearts try to make themselves feel bigger by making other people feel smaller." It was a simple explanation, but it cut through all of Blake's official justifications and bureaucratic language to expose the ugly truth underneath. This wasn't about security or protocols or risk assessment. This was about a man who felt powerless in his own life, deciding to flex what little authority he possessed against someone he perceived as having more than their fair share of success and dignity. Blake's face flushed red at the elderly woman's comment, but he pressed on with his charade. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step into the screening area now, or we're going to have to involve airport security and you're definitely going to miss your flight." 23 minutes until boarding, and Keisha realized she was standing at a crossroads that would define not just the rest of her evening, but potentially the rest of her life. The pat-down was conducted in a small alcove that offered the illusion of privacy while still being visible to anyone who cared to look, which meant that Keisha's humiliation was both intimate and public at the same time. Officer Martinez's hands moved over her body with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd been trained to depersonalize the process. But no amount of professional detachment could erase the fundamental violation of being touched and searched by a stranger while dozens of people watched and recorded. Blake Morrison stood just outside the alcove, ostensibly supervising the procedure, but really savoring every moment of Keisha's degradation. His pale blue eyes tracked every movement, cataloging each small indignity like a collector admiring his prizes. And when Martinez finished her examination and stepped back with a slight shake of her head, indicating that nothing had been found, Blake's expression didn't show disappointment so much as determination to escalate further. "Clear," Martinez reported, but her voice carried a note of unease that suggested she was beginning to question what she was participating in. "Run the explosive trace detection," Blake commanded, pulling out a small swab from his equipment kit. Full chemical screening. This was the third search now, each one more invasive than the last, and Keisha could feel her carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture. The ETD procedure required her to place her hands flat on a metal surface, while Blake swabbed her palms and fingers, looking for traces of explosive materials that they both knew didn't exist. It was security theater at its most absurd, a performance designed to demonstrate power rather than ensure safety. The machine beeped green almost immediately, indicating no traces of dangerous substances. But Blake stared at the display screen as if willing it to change its reading through sheer force of malice. Around them, the checkpoint area had begun to back up as other travelers waited for the drama to conclude, and Keisha could hear the growing murmur of complaints and frustrated sighs from people who just wanted to get to their gates and board their flights. 19 minutes until boarding, she said, quietly checking her watch and feeling the first real stab of panic about missing her flight home to her family. "I think we've established that I'm not carrying any prohibited items or dangerous materials." But Blake wasn't finished with her yet, not by a long shot. He'd invested too much of himself in this confrontation to let it end with her walking away victorious, and the small crowd of spectators that had gathered around the checkpoint only fed his need to demonstrate his authority. "Actually," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd just remembered something important, "I think we need to conduct one more examination. Something about your behavior during the screening process has been inconsistent." Inconsistent. It was a meaningless accusation that could be applied to any reaction or non-reaction, any expression or lack thereof, any word or silence. It was the kind of circular logic that made resistance futile, because any response could be twisted into evidence of guilt. Keisha felt the trap closing around her like quicksand, each struggle only pulling her deeper into Blake's web of manufactured suspicion. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd been watching the proceedings with growing indignation, finally reached her breaking point. She stood up from her chair, her granddaughter Emma's small hand still clasped in hers, and approached the checkpoint area with the kind of determined stride that suggested she'd decided to insert herself into a situation that had gone on far too long. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who'd spent decades in positions of responsibility. "I've been observing this screening process for the past 20 minutes. And I have to say that what I'm witnessing appears to be harassment rather than legitimate security procedures." Blake spun around to face this new challenge, his face already darkening with anger at the interruption. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back and mind your own business. This is an official TSA screening. This young lady, Mrs. Chen continued, gesturing toward Keisha with her free hand, has been searched multiple times, has complied with every request, and has shown no signs of suspicious behavior whatsoever. Meanwhile, dozens of other passengers have passed through your checkpoint without any additional screening. The pattern suggests bias rather than random selection." Little Emma tugged on her grandmother's sleeve, her 7-year-old mind processing the adult conversation around her with the brutal honesty that only children possessed. "Grandma Lily," she said in a voice that carried throughout the checkpoint area, "is the bad man hurting the nice lady because she has different colored skin?" The question hit the crowd like a thunderbolt, stripping away all the official language and bureaucratic justifications to expose the ugly truth that everyone could see but most had been too uncomfortable to name. A child's innocent observation had accomplished what 20 minutes of adult diplomacy and professional courtesy could not. It had forced everyone present to confront the reality of what they were witnessing. Blake's face turned an alarming shade of purple, his carefully maintained facade of official authority cracking under the pressure of being called out by a 7-year-old girl. "That's enough," he snapped, his voice losing all pretense of professional composure. "Security. I need airport security here now." But Emma Chen wasn't finished asking her questions, and her grandmother wasn't about to silence her. "Why can't she just go on her airplane?" "Grandma, she didn't do anything wrong." "Sometimes, sweetheart," Mrs. Chen replied, her voice carrying clearly over the noise of the terminal. "Adults forget that being kind is more important than being powerful, and when they forget that it's up to the rest of us to remind them." 17 minutes until boarding, and Keisha realized that the battle lines had been drawn not just between her and Blake Morrison, but between everyone who recognized injustice when they saw it and those who preferred to look away. Airport security arrived in the form of 2 bored-looking officers who clearly wanted to be anywhere else on New Year's Eve, but Blake Morrison wasn't about to let their lack of enthusiasm derail the momentum he'd built up over the past 30 minutes. He'd crossed too many lines to back down now, had invested too much of his authority and ego in breaking Keisha Washington to accept anything less than total victory. "Officers, I need this passenger escorted to a private screening room," Blake announced, his voice carrying the brittle confidence of someone doubling down on a losing bet. "She's been non-compliant throughout the screening process, and I have reasonable suspicion that she may be concealing prohibited items." The lead security officer, a middle-aged man whose name tag read Kowalski, looked between Blake's flushed face and Keisha's composed demeanor with the weary expression of someone who'd seen this movie before. "What kind of prohibited items are we talking about here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Could be anything," Blake said, waving vaguely toward Keisha as if her very existence was evidence of wrongdoing. "Electronics that don't match standard profiles, evasive responses to routine questions, behavior consistent with someone attempting to smuggle contraband through security." It was a masterpiece of circular logic accusations, so vague and subjective that they couldn't be disproven, and so official-sounding that they might convince someone who wasn't paying close attention. But Kowalski had been working airport security for 15 years, and he'd learned to recognize the difference between legitimate concerns and personal vendettas disguised as professional duty. "Has she triggered any alarms?" Kowalski asked. "Metal detector explosive trace, anything concrete?" Blake hesitated for just a moment too long before answering. "The screening equipment indicated irregularities that warrant further investigation." "That's not what I asked." Kowalski pressed his patience, clearly running thin. "Has she actually triggered any alarms or detection systems?" The pause stretched long enough for everyone present to understand that the answer was no, but Blake pressed forward anyway. "Look, I've got 8 years of experience reading passenger behavior, and everything about this woman screams high risk. Her attitude, her equipment, her responses to standard questions. I'm telling you, she's hiding something." Mrs. Chen, who had been standing quietly with her granddaughter throughout this exchange, stepped forward again with the kind of maternal authority that brooked no argument. "Officer Kowalski," she said, addressing the security supervisor directly. "My name is Lillian Chen, and I'm a retired federal judge. I've been observing this entire incident from the beginning, and what I've witnessed is a clear pattern of harassment based on nothing more than this gentleman's personal prejudices." The words "federal judge" had an electric effect on everyone within earshot, transforming Mrs. Chen from a concerned bystander into someone whose observations carried the weight of legal authority. Blake's face went pale, as he realized that his performance had been witnessed by someone who not only understood the law but had spent decades interpreting and applying it. "Ma'am," Kowalski said, his tone becoming noticeably more respectful. "Can you describe what you observed? This young woman has been subjected to multiple searches without cause." Mrs. Chen replied, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who'd spent years making legal arguments. "She's passed through all screening equipment without incident, has complied with every request, and has shown no behavior that would justify additional scrutiny. Meanwhile, this TSA officer has escalated the situation at every opportunity, despite finding no evidence of wrongdoing." Little Emma, still holding her grandmother's hand, looked up at the adults surrounding them with the kind of innocent confusion that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Why is everyone being so mean to the pretty lady?" she asked, her 7-year-old voice, somehow carrying more moral authority than all the official titles and uniforms combined. Blake realized that he was losing control of the narrative, that the story was shifting from diligent officer uncovers suspicious passenger to abusive authority figure harasses innocent woman. But he was too deep into his performance to change course, now too committed to his version of events to admit error or show mercy. "I don't care if she's Mother Teresa," he declared, his voice rising to near shouting levels. "I've got probable cause to believe this passenger is concealing contraband, and I'm going to search her until I find it. Room 4, be full strip search, and I don't want to hear another word from the peanut gallery." The phrase strip search sent a shockwave through the crowd of onlookers, transforming the scene from uncomfortable spectacle to potential outrage. Phones appeared in dozens of hands, recording lights blinking like red stars in the fluorescent airport lighting, and Keisha felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized that Blake Morrison was prepared to go to lengths that even she hadn't anticipated. 14 minutes until boarding, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. But her words were picked up by the crowd and repeated like a countdown to disaster. Kowalski looked at his watch, then at Blake's determined face, then at the growing crowd of spectators, recording every moment of what was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. "Morrison," he said carefully, "are you absolutely sure about this? Because once we go down this road, there's no going back." Blake's smile was the expression of a man who'd finally found a hill worth dying on, even if he was the only one who couldn't see that it was actually his grave. "Room 4B, he repeated. Now, Room 4B was a windowless box painted institutional beige, the kind of space designed to make people feel small and powerless, while authority figures demonstrated their control. The fluorescent lights buzzed with an electrical hum that seemed to vibrate inside Keisha's skull, and the air carried the stale smell of fear and disinfectant that clung to places where dignity went to die. Blake Morrison had finally gotten what he wanted, a private stage for the final act of his performance, away from the cameras and witnesses who might complicate his narrative of justified authority. But even as the door clicked shut behind them, sealing Keisha inside with Blake Officer Martinez and the 2 security guards, she felt a strange sense of calm settling over her like armor. For 37 minutes she'd played the role of compliant passenger, had endured humiliation and violation while trying to preserve what remained of her schedule and her dignity. But now, trapped in this beige box with nowhere to run and nothing left to lose, she finally felt free to be exactly who she was. "Strip search," Blake announced to the room, pulling on fresh latex gloves with theatrical ceremony. "Full body cavity examination if necessary. This passenger has been evasive and non-compliant throughout the screening process, and I have reasonable suspicion that she's concealing prohibited materials." Officer Martinez looked like she was going to be sick. "Morrison," she said quietly, This seems excessive. She's been through multiple searches already, and we haven't found anything." "We haven't found anything yet," Blake corrected, his pale eyes glittering with something that had moved far beyond professional duty into the realm of personal obsession. But I guarantee you she's hiding something. Rich women like this always think they're above the law, think their money and their fancy clothes make them untouchable. Well, not in my checkpoint. It was the first time he'd been completely honest about his motivations, and the naked resentment in his voice made everyone in the room uncomfortable except for Keisha herself. She'd spent 20 years navigating corporate boardrooms filled with men who smiled while they tried to destroy her, had learned to recognize the particular brand of hatred that successful black women inspired in certain types of insecure white men, and Blake Morrison was such a textbook example that he might as well have been a case study in a psychology journal. "Officer Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. "Before you proceed with whatever you're planning to do, I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with." Blake laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the beige walls. "Let me guess. You're going to tell me you're somebody important, right? You're going to threaten to sue me or get me fired or call your lawyer honey. I've heard it all before and I'm still here." "I'm sure you have." Keisha agreed, reaching slowly into the inner pocket of her Max Mara coat. "But I doubt you've heard this before." Her movements were deliberate and controlled, designed to avoid triggering any defensive reactions from the nervous security guards. But there was something in her demeanor that made everyone in the room hold their breath. The calm confidence that had carried her through 37 minutes of harassment had crystallized into something harder and more focused, like carbon compressed into diamond. "Hands." Kowalski shouted, his training kicking in as he saw her reaching for something concealed. "Let me see your hands. I'm retrieving my identification," Keisha said calmly, continuing her slow reach despite the guard's command. My real identification. What she pulled from her coat wasn't a wallet or a phone, but a slim leather case that looked expensive and official in a way that made everyone in the room suddenly nervous. She held it up so they could all see it clearly, then opened it with a smooth motion that suggested she'd performed this reveal many times before. The badge that glinted inside the case was gold and blue enamel with an eagle and scales of justice surrounding the words that made Blake Morrison's face go white as paper. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Consultant. "My name is Dr. Keisha Washington," she said, her voice filling the small room with quiet authority. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Cyber Shield Technologies, the primary cybersecurity contractor for the United States Department of Defense. I hold a top-secret/SCI clearance from the FBI, for whom I serve as a Tier 1 consultant on domestic terrorism and cyber warfare threats." Blake stared at the badge as if it were a poisonous snake, his brain struggling to process information that didn't fit with his preconceived narrative. That's fake," he stammered, but his voice carried no conviction. "You bought that online. I've seen fake FBI badges before. The laptop you were handling so carelessly." Keisha continued, ignoring his desperate protests. "Contains encrypted naval communication protocols that I'm personally delivering to the Pentagon for a security update. The suspicious electronics you found so concerning are classified Defense Department property that requires federal clearance just a touch." Officer Martinez had backed away from the examination table as if it had suddenly become radioactive, her face pale with the realization of what she'd been asked to participate in. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Morrison, what have you done? I want to see a supervisor," Blake demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "I want Janet Rodriguez down here right now. This woman is lying. She's trying to intimidate us with fake credentials." Keisha smiled for the first time since entering the checkpoint, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who'd finally decided to show her teeth. "Officer Morrison," she said softly, "your supervisor is already on her way, along with representatives from the FBI Homeland Security and the Inspector General's office. You see, when a federal asset is detained unlawfully, it triggers certain automatic protocols." She tapped her watch where a small red light had been blinking steadily. I've been recording this entire encounter, and it's been streaming live to a secure server monitored by federal authorities. They've been watching you violate my civil rights for the past 37 minutes. The silence that followed was so complete that the buzzing of the fluorescent lights sounded like thunder. And in that silence, Blake Morrison finally understood that he hadn't been hunting prey at all. He'd been walking into a trap set by someone far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. And now it was his turn to discover exactly how it felt to be powerless in the face of institutional authority. The knock on the door of room 4B came exactly 3 minutes after Keisha revealed her badge, and when it opened, it wasn't TSA Supervisor Janet Rodriguez who entered first. It was Deputy Director Harrison Walsh of the FBI's Chicago Field Office, a man whose presence instantly transformed the shabby interrogation room into a crime scene with federal implications. Walsh was followed by 2 agents in dark suits whose earpieces and alert postures marked them as serious law enforcement, not airport security, playing dress-up. Behind them came Rodriguez herself, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour, and finally a man in an expensive suit whose TSA Inspector General credentials made even the FBI agents straighten their postures slightly. Dr. Washington Walsh said, his voice carrying the kind of respectful authority that Blake Morrison had tried and failed to project all evening. "I apologize for the delay in our response. We've been reviewing the live stream from your device, and I can assure you that this situation will be resolved immediately and thoroughly." Blake stood frozen in the middle of the room like a deer caught in headlights, his latex gloves still on his hands and his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The transformation from predator to prey had happened so quickly that his brain hadn't caught up with the new reality, and he kept looking between the federal agents and his supervisor as if waiting for someone to tell him this was all an elaborate prank. Agent Walsh Rodriguez said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want you to know that the TSA does not condone this behavior in any way." Officer Morrison was acting outside of established protocols and without supervisory approval. Was he? Walsh asked, his tone carrying the kind of polite skepticism that made career bureaucrats break out in cold sweats. "Because according to our preliminary review of Dr. Washington's detention, this incident lasted 37 minutes and involved multiple searches, false accusations, and ultimately an attempt to conduct an illegal strip search. That suggests either a complete breakdown of your supervision systems or willful participation in civil rights violations." The Inspector General stepped forward, consulting a tablet that displayed what appeared to be Blake's personnel file. "Officer Morrison has 14 formal complaints in his record," he announced to the room. 7 involve allegations of racial profiling. 4 involve inappropriate conduct toward female passengers, and 3 have resulted in financial settlements to avoid litigation. This incident appears to represent an escalation in a documented pattern of abuse. Blake finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "I was just doing my job," he said, looking desperately at Rodriguez for support that wasn't coming. She was acting suspicious, carrying high-end electronics, giving evasive answers. "I followed procedure." "Procedure," Walsh repeated, and there was something in his tone that made everyone in the room take a step back. "Let me tell you about procedure, Officer Morrison. When you detain a federal asset without cause, that's a federal crime. When you conduct multiple searches without probable cause, that's a civil rights violation. When you attempt to strip search someone based on fabricated suspicions, that's sexual assault under color of law." Each accusation hit Blake like a physical blow, and Keisha watched his face cycle through the stages of realization as he began to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. This wasn't going to end with a reprimand or mandatory sensitivity training. This was going to end with handcuffs, mugshots, and federal charges that would destroy not just his career, but his entire life. "But she's just a passenger," Blake whispered, as if saying it quietly enough might make it true. "She's just some rich black woman who thinks she's better than everyone else." The words hung in the air like a confession, stripping away all pretense of legitimate security concerns and revealing the ugly truth that everyone had known, but no one had been willing to say out loud. Officer Martinez, who had been standing quietly in the corner, made a small sound of disgust and turned away from her colleague completely. Mrs. Chen's voice came from the hallway outside the room where she and Emma had been waiting with growing concern as the minutes ticked by. Officer Walsh. She called out her retired judge's authority still carrying weight. Even in her 70s, I have a young granddaughter here who has been asking why adults sometimes hurt each other for no good reason. Do you think Officer Morrison might like to explain his actions to a 7-year-old? The suggestion was devastating in its simplicity. How do you explain to a child that you targeted someone because of the color of their skin? How do you justify harassment and humiliation to someone who still believes the world should be fair and adults should protect each other rather than tear each other down? Blake looked toward the hallway where Emma's small voice could be heard, asking her grandmother when the nice lady would be allowed to go home to her family, and something in his expression finally cracked completely. I didn't mean. He started, then stopped. I wasn't trying to. She just made me so angry. Angry about what Walsh asked, his voice carrying the kind of prosecutorial precision that had sent better men than Blake Morrison to federal prison. Angry that she was successful. Angry that she was confident. Angry that she expected to be treated with the same respect you'd show any other passenger. She thought she was better than me. Blake said the words coming out in a rush of desperate honesty. Walking through here in her fancy coat with her expensive luggage, acting like she owned the place. People like that, they need to be reminded that their money doesn't make them special. It was the closest thing to a confession that anyone was likely to get, and Rodriguez looked like she wanted to crawl under the examination table and disappear. The Inspector General was typing furiously on his tablet, documenting every word for what would undoubtedly become a comprehensive investigation into TSA hiring, training, and oversight procedures. Dr. Washington Walsh said, turning to address Keisha directly, "You have my personal assurance that Officer Morrison will face the full consequences of his actions. Federal prosecutors will be reviewing this case for potential civil rights charges, and the FBI will be conducting a complete investigation into any other incidents involving discriminatory treatment at this checkpoint." Keisha nodded, but her expression remained calm and controlled. She'd gotten justice, but she took no satisfaction in Blake's destruction, because she understood that he was just one symptom of a much larger disease. "What I want," she said quietly, "is to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. No one should have to carry a federal badge to be treated with basic human dignity." Outside in the terminal, word had spread about what was happening in room 4B, and a crowd had gathered to witness Blake Morrison's walk of shame. When the door finally opened and he emerged in handcuffs flanked by FBI agents, the silence was deafening. This was the man who had spent his career making travelers feel small and powerless, now reduced to shuffling steps and downcast eyes as he was led through his own checkpoint like a common criminal. Keisha emerged behind him, her head high and her dignity intact, and the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause that echoed through Terminal 3 like thunder. 3 hours later, Keisha finally made it home to Georgetown, but not on the flight she'd originally booked. The FBI had arranged for a government jet to transport her and the classified materials she'd been carrying, treating her with the respect and courtesy that should have been routine but felt revolutionary after her experience at O'Hare. Her husband Marcus was waiting at the front door when the black SUV pulled into their driveway, and she fell into his arms with the exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she'd endured, the violation and humiliation that she'd pushed down in order to maintain her composure and fight back effectively. The girls she asked, though she could already hear 8-year-old Zara's excited voice calling from somewhere inside the house. "Fell asleep on the couch waiting for midnight," Marcus said, holding her close and breathing in the scent of her hair. They wanted to stay up to see you on the news, but I told them they could watch the recordings tomorrow. I'm on the news already, honey. You're everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, CNN, Fox, all the networks. The video of you walking out of that airport while they led that officer away in handcuffs has 15 million views and counting. People are calling it the most satisfying karma video of the decade. Keisha pulled back to look at her husband's face, seeing pride and concern warring in his dark eyes. How much of it did they show? Enough, Marcus said quietly. Enough for people to understand what happened to you, and enough for them to be angry about it. But also enough for them to see how you handled it with grace and strength and more dignity than that man deserved to witness. They were interrupted by the sound of small feet running down the hardwood hallway, and Zara burst into the foyer still wearing her New Year's Eve party dress and clutching the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2. "Mommy," she cried, launching herself into Keisha's arms with the kind of fierce hug that only children could deliver. "Hey, baby girl," Keisha whispered, lifting her daughter and holding her close. "I'm sorry I missed midnight." "It's okay," Zara said seriously, her small hands framing her mother's face. Daddy explained that sometimes grown-ups are mean to other grown-ups for stupid reasons, and you had to teach them how to be better people. Did you teach them good? The question was so innocent, and yet so perfectly aimed that Keisha felt tears threatening for the first time since the ordeal began. "I think so, sweetheart. I hope so," good Zara said with the satisfied tone of someone who believed the world could always be fixed if adults just tried hard enough. "Can we have hot chocolate now and watch the ball drop on the recording? I want to see all the confetti." Later, after Zara had fallen asleep between them on the couch and the New Year's celebrations had played out on their television screen, Keisha and Marcus talked quietly about what came next. The legal proceedings would be lengthy and complex, involving federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, and probably congressional hearings about TSA oversight and training procedures. "You know this won't end with just him," Marcus said, his arm tightened around his wife's shoulders. "This is going to be a movement. Every person who's ever been profiled or harassed at an airport is going to be watching to see what happens next." Keisha nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that was settling on her shoulders. She'd never asked to be a symbol or a spokesperson, had built her career by being excellent at what she did, rather than making waves or challenging systems. But sometimes the choice to fight back was made for you by people who mistook your desire for peace as weakness. "I keep thinking about that little girl," she said. "Emma. The way she asked why adults were being mean to each other like it was the simplest question in the world. Maybe it is that simple and we're the ones making it complicated." Her phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, and legal advocacy groups, all wanting to know her plans and her message. But the call that meant the most came at 2 a.m. from Mrs. Lillian Chen, the elderly woman who'd stood up for her in the airport. Dr. Washington. Mrs. Chen said, her voice clear despite the late hour. "I wanted you to know that Emma hasn't stopped talking about you. She keeps asking when she's going to see the brave lady again who stood up to the bullies." "She was the brave one," Keisha replied. "You both were. It would have been so much easier for you to look away," my dear Mrs. Chen said with a gentle laugh. "I spent 4 years in Japanese internment camps during World War II because people looked away when their government decided that American citizens could be enemies based on nothing more than their ancestry. I promised myself long ago that I would never be one of the people who looked away." That conversation lasted an hour. 2 women from different generations and different backgrounds finding common ground in their shared understanding of what it meant to be targeted by systems that were supposed to protect everyone equally. By the time they hung up, Keisha had found her path forward. 6 months later, the Dignity Defense Foundation was headquartered in a gleaming office building in downtown D.C., funded by the 8-figure settlement that TSA had paid to avoid a prolonged legal battle and public relations nightmare. The foundation provided legal representation, advocacy training, and financial support to travelers who faced discrimination, and its hotline received hundreds of calls every month from people who'd previously suffered in silence. Blake Morrison had been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and 5 years of supervised probation, his conviction on civil rights charges making him unemployable in any position of authority. The TSA had implemented comprehensive reforms to their screening procedures, bias training programs, and oversight mechanisms, changes that rippled through airports across the country. But the moment that meant the most to Keisha came on a sunny Tuesday morning when Mrs. Chen brought Emma to visit the foundation's offices. The little girl, now 8 years old and even more articulate than before, sat in Keisha's office chair and asked serious questions about justice and fairness and whether the world was getting better or worse for people who looked different from each other. "I think it's getting better," Keisha told her honestly. "Slowly, sometimes. Too slowly, but better. Especially when brave people like you keep asking the right questions." Emma considered this carefully, then smiled with the kind of pure joy that only children possessed. "Good," she said, "because I'm going to keep asking them until all the grown-ups know the answers." 2 years after New Year's Eve at O'Hare, Keisha Washington stood before a congressional committee investigating patterns of discrimination in federal security agencies. Her testimony part of a broader examination of how bias training and oversight failures had allowed systematic abuses to flourish unchecked. The hearing room was packed with reporters, civil rights advocates, and travelers who'd found the courage to share their own stories after seeing what could happen when someone refused to accept injustice as the price of travel. What we discovered through this incident, Keisha told the assembled representatives, wasn't just one officer acting badly, but an entire culture that allowed personal prejudices to masquerade as professional judgment. Real security is based on objective criteria and consistent application of procedures, not on whether someone looks like they belong in first class. The reforms that followed were comprehensive and lasting. The TSA implemented mandatory body cameras for all screening personnel, established independent oversight boards with community representation, and created clear protocols for passengers to challenge inappropriate treatment in real time. More importantly, they began recruiting from communities that had been historically targeted, ensuring that the faces behind the badges better reflected the diversity of American travelers. Blake Morrison had served his sentence and disappeared from public view, but his case became a cautionary tale taught in law enforcement training programs across the country. The legal precedent established by his conviction strengthened civil rights protections for all travelers and created a framework for holding federal employees accountable when they abused their authority. Mrs. Chen and Emma had remained close friends with Keisha's family. Their relationship deepened by shared experience and mutual respect. Emma, now 10 years old, had started her own anti-bullying initiative at her school, teaching other children that standing up for what's right was more important than staying comfortable or fitting in. "The nice lady taught me that sometimes you have to be brave even when you're scared," Emma explained to a local news reporter covering her school's character education program. And grown-ups need to remember that just because you can be mean doesn't mean you should be mean. The Dignity Defense Foundation had expanded beyond airport discrimination to address bias in all forms of federal law enforcement, providing legal support and advocacy training to communities that had previously felt powerless in the face of institutional prejudice. Their work had resulted in policy changes, financial settlements, and, most importantly, a growing awareness that dignity wasn't a privilege to be earned, but a right to be protected. On quiet evenings at home in Georgetown, when the foundation's work was done for the day and her family was gathered around the dinner table, Keisha often thought about that moment in room 4B when she'd decided to reveal her badge and fight back. The easy path would have been to submit to Blake Morrison's harassment to miss her flight and swallow her anger, and add her experience to the countless untold stories of travelers who'd been targeted and humiliated in the name of security. But Emma Chen's innocent questions about fairness and adult behavior had reminded her that someone was always watching, always learning from how power was used and whether justice was possible when the odds seemed stacked against it. Children like Emma and Zara would inherit the world that adults created through their choices to speak up or stay silent, to challenge injustice or accommodate it for the sake of convenience. "Did we change everything?" Zara asked one evening, now 10 years old and beginning to understand the complexities of the world her mother navigated. "We changed some things," Keisha replied honestly, "and we showed people that change was possible. But the real work happens every day in every choice to treat people with dignity and respect, even when no cameras are recording and no one will ever know the difference." "That sounds hard," Zara said. "It is hard," Keisha agreed, "but it's also the most important work any of us will ever do." If this story of standing up to injustice resonated with you, please like and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, dignity, and the power of refusing to be broken by those who mistake authority for righteousness. Share your own experiences in the comments below, and remember that every voice matters in the fight for a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Together we can build a future where no one has to carry a badge to be treated with basic human dignity.